The psychotronic control system. It would be one thing if our entire religious history were shaped, quite deliberately and at a fundamental level, by the close encounter phenomenon. This is already very difficult for most people who study UFOs to accept. Those who acknowledge the antiquity of the phenomenon, some are so abstrusedly fearful that they do not, still would like to believe that if it has shaped human religious belief, it has been because we have projected the subconscious symbolism of our own fears and hopes onto the phenomenon. Others recognize some level of interaction between the UFO intelligences and the prophets or sages of various religions, but they would like to attribute all of the violent and inhuman elements of various belief systems to misinterpretations on our side of these close encounters, or to human manipulations of UFO messages that were intrinsically benevolent or consciousness-raising. Very few people are capable of accepting the conclusion that the reader ought to have been forced to seriously consider by now that we have been deliberately and repeatedly manipulated by putatively divine beings who consider us their slaves, and this has basically shaped almost all of mankind's religious experience. This has proven to be true even of Buddhism and Gnosticism, the two types of religion that one would imagine would be least shaped by close encounters. These more philosophical sects are also unnatural reactions to the manipulation of human life and the misery of the human condition as it has been determined by the shining stupidity of super Tamerlanes. All of that would be bad enough, but it gets worse, much worse. Those who have studied near-death experiences, NDEs, and close encounters of the fourth kind in a comparative manner have come to the conclusion that there is a deep, extensive connection between the two types of phenomena. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that the angelic and demonic beings witnessed during the NDEs, as well as the life review and the councils of spirit guides and so forth, are all of a piece with the kind of manipulation at work in many UFO abductions. The perpetrators may be the same in more cases than one would want to believe. At the very least, it appears that there is a psychotronic technology that allows the beings behind close encounters to cut into the process of death, the afterlife, and reincarnation so as to manipulate human souls with a view to maintaining certain repressive and disempowering social structures. Psychotronic, is a word that was coined in the Soviet Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Literally, it is a contraction of the word tron, which means space, arena, or domain, with the word psyche. But the word deliberately brings to mind comparisons with electronics and other technology. Given its dialectical materialist ideology, the Soviet Union wanted an alternative to the word parapsychology without the same associations with the occult, and one that would be more scientifically minded or oriented toward the technical. So psychotronics was chosen to suggest a science of the psyche that could yield technological development just like any other theoretical science. Here, the term psychotronic is adopted to suggest a spectral technology of psychic machines and psychophysical technique that treat the soul as a form of energy that can be manipulated. The basic idea behind this can be seen in a Carvinal-esque form in the American popular franchise of the Ghostbusters. The communists took that approach to psi very seriously. The psychotronic machinations has been going on for our entire recorded history, from the Deva management of reincarnation to encounters with Jesus Christ during NDEs. As we shall see, a group within the US government who became aware of this dimension of close encounters came to the conclusion that the entire phenomenon is a demonic deception. That was the only way that the majority of this group could maintain their religious faith in a Christian conception of life after death and spiritual salvation. Namely, to deny the evidence that they uncovered themselves, we suggest that their religious faith was manufactured for them by beings who try to manipulate us after death. Dr. Kenneth Ring is a psychologist and academic who spent many years studying and writing about the phenomenon of near-death experiences, NDEs. Initially, Ring wanted nothing to do with abductions or the UFO phenomenon, but he eventually had to admit that certain features of the accounts of abductees lined up very uncomfortably with what he was familiar with as the phenomenology of NDEs. Consequently, Ring conducted his own comparative study of the two phenomena, presenting his findings in the Omega Project. Not only do the NDE experiencers and abductees report some of the same types of beings and a similar structure to their altered states, Some of the same physical effects ensue from having had both types of experiences, such as, for example, an experiences interference with electronic devices like digital wristwatches, radios, or TVs in their environs. It is as if the person has been magnetized. The most important outcome of the Ring's study was his conclusion that both NDE experiences and abductees had suffered from more trauma during childhood than the average person, and that this had led them to develop what he calls an encounter-prone personality. And of course, a debunker reading this would misunderstand what Ring means here and what the data suggests. By no means are these individuals merely imagining, confabulating, or making up their experiences because they were traumatized as children. Rather, their childhood trauma gives them a twin capability of dissociation from the deep structure of consensus reality, which compels most people to deny that such experiences are even possible, and absorption of a kind that blocks out environmental stimuli other than whatever is the psychical point of focus. This combination of qualities makes these individuals more likely to recall experiences that may be a lot more widespread than we would realize, but for their unique antennas. In effect, it is as if such encounter-prone individuals have been red-pilled to some degree and are more aware of the matrix that we are all living in than the rest of us. What really changed Ring's mind about UFO abductions was his having read Whitley Streiber's Communion. Streiber and his wife Anne had suspected that there was some connection between the abduction phenomenon and death, or the afterlife. After Communion came out, Whitley Streiber was inundated with letters from people who had similar experiences. Anne Streiber became the designated reader of these letters, and it was not long before she noticed a number of patterns that cut through the correspondences. The most intriguing and disturbing one was this. The putative aliens, seemed to have access to recently deceased friends or relatives of the abductees, and they appeared to be able to bring the abductees into the same realm or dimension that the afterlife, experience takes place in during NDEs. It is also the case that about 30% of people who have an NDE start to see UFOs after their NDE. Robert Hartland, who had an NDE as a result of a bad reaction to anesthetic gas during a dental procedure, wound up being given a tour of a UFO while outside of his body and in an astral, state. He reported that small ugly creatures, tried to prevent his return from this afterlife realm, and he also accurately described what the dentist had done while he was unconscious and the dentist was frantically trying to prevent him from dying in his chair. Before he was finally revived, the Greys explained to him how UFOs operate and gave him a message about the apocalyptic destruction of Earth. The most extensive account of such involvement of the Greys with the afterlife comes from the case of Betty Andreasson Luca, which was already briefly mentioned in Chapter 2, with a promissory note that we would return to this spectacular abduction to consider its religious dimensions. Betty was the wife of James Andreasson and mother of 7 children, including her eldest daughter, Becky, who was born in 1955. On the evening of January 25, 1967, about an hour after dinner, the lights and the television that the kids had been watching flickered off. Then another strange light began to pulsate from outside their windows. At this point, a group of Greys entered the house through the door. Not by opening the door, they walked right through the closed door. Then they froze everyone in the house except for Betty, as if they had a switch to turn off all the other members of her family, placing them into a kind of suspended animation. Betty was so disturbed by this that she was able to convince them to reanimate her daughter Becky as a demonstration that the rest of her family would be alright as well. Becky also recalls these experiences. Betty was told to stand in line with the Greys, whereupon she was slightly levitating, and they all went out through the closed door the same way that the Greys had come into her house. According to Betty, the house was surrounded with a kind of haze that they got outside, so that the rest of the neighborhood was not visible. Then she boarded a silvery gold ovoid shift with the Greys, although one of them stayed behind to guard the house to make sure that nobody woke up or that no neighbors arrived during the abduction. To make a very long story short, Betty's experiences are relevant to the present discussion because she was taken by the craft down into a body of water and an underwater complex, where she met beings who purported to be angels and where she was afforded an opportunity to meet God. The angels, were tall platinum blonde or white-haired beings that perfectly fit the description of the Nordics. These Elohim called themselves elders, even though their faces were fresh and young-looking. Becky, who under hypnotic regression remembered having been abducted by these elders since infancy and throughout her childhood, called them the pretty persons, undercourse. They basically look like Swedish supermodels, as tall as basketball players, wearing white robes. It was made clear to Betty that the 3 or 4 foot tall grey beings were like androids or rovers under the control of these Nordic looking angels, undercourse. She was told that they are watchers, undercourse, who monitor our actions and thoughts, making a divine record of them. Betty was taken by one of the elders and a couple of greys who followed along to a great door, undercourse, with white light and beautiful music, undercourse, emanating from it. She saw beings of light beyond this door on their way to the one, undercourse, that dwells in the world of light, undercourse, who she was given to understand was God. During her hypnotic regression, Betty was at a loss to explain what this ineffable being was like or what secrets the one shared with her. Other than that, she was very clearly told that this one sent Jesus into our world as a savior and that Christ would be coming back soon. At one point, they even took Betty to watch as they fought a tug of war with dark demonic beings to take the soul of a dying man in a hospital bed. Of course, it never occurred to the jealously Christian housewife that what she was watching was a staged good cop, bad cop routine that was intended to be reported so that it would reinforce certain expectations about the afterlife. Betty Andreasson was primarily studied by UFO abduction researcher Raymond E. Fowler. Besides Kenneth Ring, Fowler is the researcher who has done most to document patterns that connect abduction experiences to NDEs. Fowler identified at least a dozen features of many NDEs and UFO abductions that are identical. These are 1. Out-of-body experiences, 2. Approaching the light, 3. Greetings by loving or familiar beings, 4. Meeting robed entities, 5. Encountering beings of light, 6. Turning into light, 7. Communication by means of telepathy, 8. Being taken home, undercourse, or being invited to go home, undercourse, 9. Encountering timelessness or a disruption of the normal spatio-temporal continuum, 10. Wishing to remain in the light, 11. Understanding love, 12. Raising environmental awareness. Those who are only familiar with the UFO abductions from depictions of them in popular culture may be unaware that many abduction cases share all of these elements in common with NDEs. Furthermore, Fowler found that a disturbing number of abductees have had the aliens, undercourse, tell them about someone's death either shortly before the person unexpectedly died or at the time of the person's death, but before the abductee could be informed about it by any normal means. They seem to keep track of who is dying and when, and based on what Betty Andreasson and some of the people who wrote letters to Anne Streiber suggested, this may be because they are the ones escorting souls into the afterlife. The Andreasson case strongly suggests that the angelic beings, undercourse, who are witnessed as members of a life review, undercourse, panel of spirit guides, undercourse, during a near-death experience are actually Nordics. The life review, undercourse, which is described as akin to a very fast-paced review of everything that has happened in someone's life, is an experience that takes place after a person goes into the light, undercourse, or the luminescent tunnel that appears sometime after they float up out of the body that they leave behind on a hospital bed or ER table. Sometimes there is administrative bungling, undercourse, and a person who was not supposed to be brought over to the other side, undercourse, is sent back with haste after a squabble between managers and underlings in the afterlife realm. The cases of these that involve mistaken transportation of a person's soul to hell, undercourse, are particularly striking. Contrary to the portrayal of NDEs in mainstream media, there are as many hellish accounts of the afterlife reported by those who experience a period of clinical death as there are heavenly ones. In one such experience, an Indian man named Durga Jatav was taken to hell, undercourse, where his legs were severed by demons, undercourse, to foil his repeated attempts to run away from them. When the administrators of hell looked up his papers, his captors were scolded for having brought the wrong man. They then showed Jatav a number of pairs of recently severed legs. Apparently there is a collection of these in hell. He chose the ones that were his, and these were reattached before he was sent back. This story could, of course, be dismissed as utterly ridiculous, were it not for the fact that Jatav was finally revived a couple of hours after his body had gone cold and his family had assumed he was dead. Very noticeable fissures appeared on his knees, as if they were scars from the amputation and reattachment of his legs. There are other cases of this kind, and they align very closely with mistaken abductions from the UFO literature. Indeed, there are reports from abductees to the effect that the beings subjecting them to torturous examinations on board a UFO, usually by Greys, were suddenly informed by one of their superiors, usually a Nordic, that they had mistakenly taken the wrong person. Sometimes abductions are even interrupted during the initial phase, say when the beam of light from a UFO is shining on a car and the beings who are about to take the paralyzed potential abductee are stopped by their superiors, who telepathically tell the underlings tasked with the abduction that they have the wrong person. Some UFO abductees have been told that their abductors recycle souls, in other words, that they are in charge of the process of reincarnation. To be sure, there are many cases of the transition between death and rebirth that have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with UFOs and close encounters. Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia researched tens of such cases over the course of decades and carried out a phenomenological analysis of them. In many of these cases, upon death, a person will wander around as they would in an OBE, out-of-body experience, experiencing the world around them until they become fixated on a recently pregnant woman who will be their mother in a subsequent incarnation. Usually, this period of being disembodied, during which they watch their future mother and other persons in their environs, such as other members of their future family, will last for weeks, not many months or years. Most people seem not to wait years before reincarnating. In some cases, which are difficult to phenomenologically distinguish from possession, a deceased individual will reincarnate in the body of a child who is already partly grown, maybe even 7 or 8 years old. If the child gives up the ghost, during a potentially fatal illness so that the child's body becomes vacant of a personality but then biologically recovers, at some point shortly after the child's soul has already left it. In these walk-in, cases of reincarnation, family and friends are shocked by the new personality inside the body of the recovered child. In some of these cases, the new personality will afford the child the ability to speak a language that the child never learned, the language that the person reincarnating into that child spoke. The point of all this is simply that there appears to be a process of death and rebirth that is independent of the beings involved with close encounters, but the latter appear to have the ability to massively interfere with this process by some psychotronic means in order to produce experiences of heaven, hell, meeting dead relatives, having a life review, counseling with spirit guides, and so on and so forth. All of this begins with a tunnel of light, appearing during the out-of-body experience or near-death experience. At one point, Whitley Streiber had an encounter with a very strange man who showed up at his hotel room late one night and, among other revelations, told him that this light is a kind of soul trap, used to lure dead people and individuals who are near death into a condition where they can be manipulated by beings who have mastered a kind of spectral technology. It is noteworthy that the majority of Stevenson's reincarnation cases involved spontaneous past life recall by young children who, should they have been encouraged rather than discouraged or dismissed by the parents, might have succeeded in recalling their past lives. Could it be that such individuals do not remember close encounters in the transition between death and rebirth for the same reason that it is relatively natural for them to start remembering their past lives? It may be that the UFO intelligences are wiping the memories of souls who enter the light, just as they induce amnesia in abductees who experience missing time, Like UFO abductees who need to undergo regression hypnosis to remember what happened to them during this missing time, most people can only remember past lives with the assistance of a qualified practitioner of hypnotic regression. One piece of evidence for massive psychotronic manipulation of the process of death and rebirth has to do with the apparent efficacy of zodiacal astrology. There is no legitimate naturalistic explanation for how the positions of the planets, let alone zodiacal star constellations, at the time of a person's birth could influence their personality profile and the broad contours of an individual's life. Nevertheless, scientific studies, such as the one conducted by Michael Gackelin, have established that there is a very statistically significant correlation between the position of certain planets in the natal chart of an individual and the career path that this person will wind up taking. As if this were not perplexing enough, There have been studies that closely correlate the zodiac signs of a person with that individual's personality type and the typical behavioral profile, including the tendency to commit certain crimes. Consider this in the context of the evidence presented in Chapter 5, to the effect that the human civilization is vastly more ancient than we have been led to believe, and that for the majority of it, terrestrial society was governed by gods, of course, who created us in their own image and whose architectural structures attest to a totalitarian mindset. The zodiacal calendar of the precession of the equinoxes was a common inheritance of all the cultures that preserved certain aspects of this prehistoric global civilization, from ancient Egypt to Mayan America. Many of their monuments are zodiacally aligned to certain star constellations with a precision comparable to that of this calendar itself. Could it then be the case that the prehistoric civilization governed by the gods, which endured from the genetic engineering of mankind about 750,000 years ago until the collapse of Atlantis 12,000 years ago, set up some kind of system to time the births of various types of people as part of classifying them into the caste hierarchy that was a feature of the society? A system that used psychokinesis in conjunction with zodiacal symbolism in order to deeply embed certain expectations and tendencies into the collective unconscious and to guide individuals of a certain type to be born at a particular time or pursue life paths that have one or another typological contour. The socio-political framework for such a system may have collapsed together with Atlantis or with its immediate successor cultures like Sumer, but the PK field established by this system at the level of the collective unconscious may still be functioning in a degraded fashion, as it were, automatically and residually, like a haunting by a pattern imprinted from a very deep past of ingrained behavior. Then again, as I've suggested before, the efficacy of astrology could just be evidence for our living inside of some simulacrum that, because it is earth-centered, renders the planets and star constellations of the zodiac much more meaningful parts of the game's logic than they would be if we were living in a holographic universe as vast as the cosmos that we believe we perceive through the Hubble telescope. The idea of a simulacrum does have some connection to the question of the relationship between death, the afterlife, and the close encounters. It is believed that DMT is naturally produced near death, and some have speculated that its flooding of the brain at this time is responsible for the visions seen in NDEs. According to the alien information theory of Andrew Gallimore, unlike other psychedelics, DMT blocks out normal sensory input altogether rather than merely modifying it. But it also affords access to a higher level of the computational cosmos than the cosmic game that we're living inside of now. We could be avatars of players from this higher programming level, or at least those of us who are not non-player characters, NPCs could be, in which case death, karma, and reincarnation would be akin to multiple lives needed to accomplish the quest in a video game, as Rizwan Virk suggests. Virk even considers NDEs and UFO encounters, together with older accounts of revelations and records bestowed by angels, as evidence for our existing inside of some information processing system similar to massively multiplayer online role-playing games. The problem with both Gallimore and Virk is their unjustified assumption that the programmers of the cosmic game are benevolent, and their attribution of more agency to us within the context of this game, than the close encounter phenomenon suggests that we have. Consider the numbers, cases, which John Keel discovered in the course of the research that he did to try to understand what the Mothman of the Point Pleasant could possibly have been. In areas where there are periodically high concentrations of UFO sightings, known as flaps, people occasionally hear a sequence of seemingly meaningless numbers interrupt their radio or television broadcast, and sometimes these pirate numbers broadcasters address individuals directly. Keel writes, "Voices counting off meaningless numbers also caught in on TV reception in UFO flap areas. But the phenomenon is not always restricted to electrical apparatus. After I published a couple of pieces about it, I received dozens of letters from people throughout the country recounting their own experiences. To my surprise, most of the people had heard the voices late at night, usually waking them up with a sharp command. For example, a man in the southwest claimed he had been jarred awake on several different nights by the sound of a deep male voice ordering, 'Wake up, 49!' A woman in Ohio heard the voice while driving, '873, you are 873. And another woman in Kansas wrote, 'Please tell me who these people are that keep reading numbers to me. They sound as if they are standing right next to me, But there is no one there. Is each of us a numbered prisoner in the matrix? If so, who is number one? The following is an even more horrifying case that brings the matrix to mind, especially the scene where Neo wakes up from the first time inside of this amniotic pod and sees the fields of naked human batteries stretching out in every direction under the dead sky. There have been NDE close encounters as horrifying as Neo's awakening. Paul Garratt was a house painter who nearly died in a car crash in San Francisco in 1969. After the ambulance rushed him to the hospital, his heart stopped. As doctors struggled to revive him in the ER, Garratt had an NDE involving UFOs. It began with Garratt having the sense that he was not rising out of his body, but falling very fast into a dark and bottomless abyss. Then he found that he had landed on a beach with light blue sand, which stretched for as far as he could see, and which was covered by naked human bodies writhing and screaming in agony. Above the bodies, streaking across a purple sky, were hundreds of UFOs shaped more or less like classic flying saucers, but pulsing and throbbing as if they were themselves sentient beings, like metallic mantas or technological stingrays. Garratt said that he got the impression that they were akin to soldier ants dutifully carrying out tasks of vital importance as they zipped back and forth at high speed. These UFOs sent beams down to bathe each of this body in a sickly green glow, at which point the luminescent orb of that person's soul would be extracted from their body as they screamed for the last time. Garratt somehow knew that these balls of light sucked up into the UFOs were being used as something like fuel for the craft and or the intelligence piloting them. The soul-harvested bodies all eventually went dead silent, but then all of them eventually stood up and marched together like zombies into a huge black hole that had opened up on the horizon on the beach. At this point, Garratt was successfully revived in the ER. After this NDE, Garratt, who had never had UFO experiences before this, began to have late-night close encounters, and he was left with the impression that he was being monitored because he had witnessed something he was not supposed to see. What? Hell? Or a psychotronic technology at work, manipulating mankind at the deepest level? This case was one of a number of such experiences studied by the Collins elite. Much disinformation has been promulgated through the meme of MJ-12, or the Majestic 12, of course, a supposed elite group of US government officials and select contractors formed after the Roswell incident to work on the UFO problem at a level above top secret. Extensive documents allegedly belonging to this group have supposedly been leaked, and a debate rages over whether they are authentic, in part or in whole, or whether they represent some sophisticated forgery, most likely by the government itself as a part of a disinformation campaign. But there was a real group of US government officials formed in 1947 to study close encounters, including the material and the bodies recovered at the Roswell crash site. The group consisted of about 15 individuals, with representatives from Army intelligence, Naval intelligence, the Air Force, and a budget secured by the Pentagon but funneled through the CIA's Directorate of Plans in a way that would evade Congress. The Collins elite still exists today, albeit in a new generation of members. What they have concluded, after more than 70 years of studying the close encounter phenomenon, is that we are not dealing with aliens, from outer space, but with demons from hell, who are trying to gain access to the inner space of the human psyche. They came to believe that the seemingly advanced craft, the apparent medical examinations, hybridization program, and so forth, were all ruses and disguises of the devil. The putative science and technology behind the phenomenon was more akin to ancient alchemy and ritualistic black magic. For example, their analysis of the bodies recovered at Roswell revealed that these were only simulacra of organic beings. They were actually something like ectoplasmic golem, akin to materializations conjured by the most adept physical mediums in the late 19th and early 20th century. Understand that these high-level military and intelligence officers were not particularly pious to begin with, but what they found over decades of studying the phenomenon, with carte blanche access to all that the US government knew about close encounters, turned them into deeply religious and profoundly terrified men. The Collins elite came to believe that, positioned as they were at the dark heart of the shadow government of the most powerful nation on earth, they were the guardians of the apocalypse. Any disclosure, of what they really knew about close encounters would be spun by the phenomenon itself as alien contact, if not an alien invasion, This could have only two possible outcomes, which are not mutually exclusive. First, the danger that society would collapse altogether in the face of the hysterical terror and the frightful madness that would spread through the population when they were told that there was evidence that the afterlife is managed by UFOs and that Jesus was an alien, underquotes. Second, if this chaos could be contained and shaped into a new order at all, it would most certainly have to be under the reign of a single world government founded on a new religion beyond good and evil, underquotes, and a paradigm shift, underquotes, to a worldview beyond both Abrahamic revelations and materialist modern science. In the view of the Collins elite, this scenario represents nothing less than the advent of the reign of the Antichrist. They considered it, and they still consider it, their sacred duty to hold back this beast. That is the real reason for UFO secrecy in Judeo-Christian America.